So I'm going to do a bit called Hitchens Goes Beast Mode, which is about Peter Hitchens getting into a massive, epic argument with Michael Rosen on Twitter about the decline of grammar schools. But first, let's do a little promotion of our premium book club on Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground that we did, last week?
Yeah.
I don't understand time anymore. Every day is the same to me. It was good, though, wasn't it? And it's done quite well. Good comments.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I really appreciated it. And it was, a lot of people really appreciated the discussion of theology right towards the end. But I suppose if you don't go to a good school, you're going to end up like this basement-dwelling goblin. So learn to avoid it.
But there's also loads of bants in it as well. So it's, it's got something for everyone. So check that out. And let's crack on with this segment then. So this is all about the decline of grammar schools. We always hear about grammar schools in this country. They're it's an election-winning thing in the Conservative Party to say, I'm going to bring them back. And Liz Truss has done exactly this. If we see this, there you go. Liz Truss suggests she'll lift ban on new grammar schools. So Liz Truss, one thing I like about her, and before everyone tweets or comments, she's WEF, she's relatively okay.
I don't actually think she is. I think she's just a blithering idiot.
People said she wasn't, and then some people said no, she was just on the website. And, you couldn't barely talk about the candidates without people shouting at you that they're all shills. And so let's just assume that and crack on. So what I like about her, though, is that she's from a comprehensive school like me, and she's said that they're rubbish, so she's going to send their kids to a grammar school, and she wants more people to have that chance. And then someone replied to this in the Times, actually, not literally because it was a Telegraph, but they replied in the Times to Liz Truss in general, and they said, Liz Truss wants to create a new generation of grammar schools. As the eldest of 6 children from a council estate, going to a grammar was my only chance of social mobility, but I cannot bring myself to support this move. What? I'm painfully conscious that I was able to attend the grammar at the expense of the other 4/5 of my age group who went to secondary moderns where the teaching seemed dire and the expectations even worse. It's a classic thing. I went to a grammar school. It changed my life. I want to take that away from other people because I feel guilty and because the secondary moderns were apparently rubbish.
Yeah, it's the education equivalent of white guilt.
Basically, yeah. And if you don't know much about, we have a lot of US listeners may or may not know a lot about our education system. Basically, in this country, we have public schools, which are fee-paying schools for posh people. We have private schools, which are fee-paying schools for posh people. We have boarding schools, which are fee-paying schools for posh people, but it can be public or private, I suppose. We have comprehensive/state schools that plebs like me had to go to. And then we have grammar schools, which are not the same as the old grammar schools, but there's a few left, and they're in. You basically have to be in the right area.
Yeah, they're public. So I think they still only exist in Kent. They're publicly funded, but educationally selective. So you've got to take the 11+ exam. There's an English and a maths test. There used to be 3. There was also a non-verbal reasoning test with like shapes and maps, like it used to be like the old IQ test. But if you pass that by a specific set, I think the threshold is, I can't remember the number now, but it might have been 180. If you pass that with your combined grades, then you can have your pick of the selective grammar schools. Yep.
Right, but there are far fewer. There's something like 160 versus 1,300 in the past, and they're different. They've taken on the comprehensive school exam system, so they're not as good as they used to be. They're still better than other things, but what they used to do was people like Melvin Bragg, who's an example that springs to my mind because he's from Cumbria, where I'm from. He was working class. Now he's a lord. And if you go to his Wikipedia, it just says Bragg was one of an increasing number of working-class teenagers of the era being given a path to university through the grammar school system. So it changed people's lives, and his school is now incomprehensive. It was changed in 1969, and this is what you find. And actually, there was an article with him from 2012 where I agreed with Carol Codswallop.
Carol Codwaller.
Yeah, that one. I've never known how to say her name. Well-known lefty Guardian maniac. But I actually agreed with her. She did this piece on Melvin Bragg, and she said, Bragg is a product of the high watermark of social mobility, from his grammar school education to his free university place to his maintenance grant to the purchase of his family home on a single modest salary, all these things that we've lost. He's a member of the lucky generation, the ones who, for the first time ever, could rise through the classes by way of the grammar schools and access to universities at a time when being a graduate made you a member of a privileged elite. And he tries to play it down, but that's what it did. You had social mobility, and that was taken away from us. And another one was Dennis Potter, who was a good example, the famous playwright, who, again, father was a coal miner, but was able to go to a grammar school and change his life. And that was a generation who had social mobility, and that was taken away. My dad came from a very poor background, had to do homework under the sheets with a torch. They wanted him to work in a factory. But he passed the 11+, we went to a grammar school. Many years later, I go to a rubbish comprehensive school where we have 20-something people in the class, even at A-level. I got the 3rd highest grade in the country at A-level anyway on history, but no one said go to Oxbridge or anything like that. We didn't have that kind of chance. We didn't understand it. We wouldn't have been past the interview. We were clueless. And this is a typical comprehensive. Ofsted were looking at it to shut it down. Well, they didn't shut it down in the end. It just about passed. But you get the idea. Yep. We've lost that social mobility. And this is the subject of Peter Hitchens' new book, A Revolution Betrayed, How Egalitarians Wrecked the British Education System. And as we have that link, John, and Peter Hitchens, argues that in trying to bring about an educational system which is egalitarian, the politicians have created a system which is the exact opposite. Doesn't sound like the left, does it? But there you go. It's utopianism. And so what Hitchens has done, he released this sign on Twitter that he's designed. So he's redesigned the sign for schools with the old school they used to have a sign meaning this is a school.
Yeah.
And it was a young lady with a satchel following a young man with a school book. And this was changed. And he said, I devised this symbol for the destruction of the grammar schools, a prohibition sign over the pre-1965 British traffic sign for a school. Note the uniforms on the figures, quite unlike the modern sign. So he's been posting this a lot because he loves it. And
yeah, that's actually interesting because much like when Harry and I covered Michael Knowles' Speechless, if words and symbols have inextricable moral standards encapsulated in them.
Right.
And this transmits sort of the British aesthetic, but also a standard. You've got to wear the uniform, you're dedicated to your education, and it's particular. Whereas now the modern school sign is like the bathroom sign of the square, the woman made up entirely of triangles, and then the smaller woman made up entirely of triangles.
Yes.
Yeah, there's nothing, there's no expectation laden in the symbol.
Right. And the woman who designed the new sign, post-60s, actually explains it in the next link in the Guardian. She says, the hardest but most satisfying sign is the children crossing. The first school sign was a torch, then a boy followed by a girl with a satchel, the one we just saw. It looked very grammar school. I wanted it to look more inclusive, so you couldn't tell it was secondary modern or grammar, and I wanted it to be more caring, so I made the little girl lead the little boy. Do we have that sign, John? There we go. So what you have now instead, little blobs, it's a girl leading a boy. It doesn't really mean anything except inclusion and sort of lefty blobbishness.
Yeah, subversive, subliminal leftist indoctrination. That's fascinating.
Yep. Yeah. That's what we talk about on this show.
Yeah.
So that's what you end up with. Now, so Hitchens posted his sign on Twitter because he's been promoting his book. And he said, look, this is my sign about the grammar schools. And Michael Rosen, a sort of popular children's author, replied,
going on a bear hunt, right?
He roused the beast. He said, what sign have you got for the Save the Secondary Modern Schools? You never reply to Peter Hitchens. Don't even mention the name Peter Hitchens. You don't even have to at him. If you say his name, he will find you and he will kill you.
Yeah. Don't say it 3 times in a mirror or show up and hit you over the head with an e-scooter.
Once is enough. He'll find you and he'll kill you with logic. Because I once said a nice thing about him and he retweeted it, but you just have to put his name.
Yeah.
So Hitchens replies, of course, and he says, the same one will do. How much do you actually know about the much smeared secondary mods? My book, out in November, looks hard at this often misrepresented type of school. So Hitchens' point is that everyone accepts that grammar schools were elite and very good, but they say, but we had to have secondary moderns, which were rubbish. And it's not worth the sacrifice. Most people didn't get the chance to go to grammar. Hitchens' point here is not only were the grammar schools elite, the secondary moderns were still better than the comprehensives we have now, is his argument. So he says, what do you know to Rosen? Rosen hits back with his credentials, and he says, try the website that my wife and I started so that former secondary moderners could contribute, blah, blah, blah. My dad taught in one of the first comps. My stepmother taught in one. He goes on and on. And that's, he does know something about it. But then Hitchens hits back with this. If people knew more about secondary moderns, the sneer, but if you have grammars, you'd also have secondary mods, would lose its force, which is the point I just made, actually, that he's saying that's fine. Yeah, he's saying Chad yes to all of it.
Yeah, it's he's standing for meritocracy, and yes, people will be marginalized by categorization and delineating for merit, but it's better than lowest common denominator thinking, because when you try and have equality, you go immediately to the lowest common denominator. You drag everyone down to the subpar standard. And so that's why they abluted the school sign, for example, because they wanted to first nihilistically remove the standard and then supplant it with their new progressive standard, which is at odds with reality.
Yeah, and I'll give you a great example from my schooling of, if you can call it that, comprehensive school. We had 20 odd people in business studies A-level, and only 6 of us passed in the modular exam. We had these modular exams. I was one of the 6, so I'm not an idiot. But then, because everyone else got distracted by some young enterprise nonsense. Anyway, only 6 of us passed. What was the solution? He resat everyone into the exam, except 6 of us who were left to just sort of loiter around and mess about. And that's how you pander to the lowest common denominator, and that's awful, in my opinion. So, yeah, he carries on, and he says, Hitchens, that the problem with secondary moderns, number 6, this is John, is that actually people were prevented from taking exams, which was a lefty idea. And he clarifies in the next week, this was from 1944 to 55, that actually there was this weird idea that you shouldn't even take exams in secondary moderns.
We can see that now in the American school districts, where they're saying that we shouldn't have any examinations in Portland, for example, because the black students were scoring lower on average than the white students, and so it would be racist to have disparate outcomes, therefore dispense with meritocracy. So no hurt feels.
Yeah. Good comparison. And then the next one, he points out, so Rosen is saying that the problem is lots of people would leave secondary moderns without any qualifications at all. But then Hitchens is hitting back with the point that the qualifications we have now, many now leave bog standard comps with qualifications, inverted commas, which are worthless to them. It's self-deceiving that they're any better off than secondary modern pupils who after the mid-50s were allowed to take serious exams. So he's saying, and the next one he clarifies with exam inflation, because Rosen says, the old dodge, rubbish the qualifications that people got, etc., etc. And then Hitchens goes, I didn't realize you disputed the existence of exam inflation. Can we go back to that one? Do you then maintain that today's GCSEs are equal in value to the pre-1965 O-levels, or that today's A-levels are equal in value to the pre-1965 namesakes? And he often makes the point, Hitchens, that pre-1965, an A-level in this country, Britain, was considered the equivalent roughly to a degree in the United States.
Right.
Sorry to American listeners. They tried to take our talent. It was called the brain drain because our schools were so good. And
that actually explains the British invasion as well of creatives into the comic industry in the 80s, because all of the great stories that were told were all from British writers. Like the Americans just had a complete deficit of talent at that time. So it does explain why, literary prowess, for example, might have flourished in the arts, and they took all the talent overseas.
Yeah, I'm sure many things flourished. And then what happened was, he says in the next one, number 10, comps diluted the exam. So basically the comprehensives, when everything became comprehensive, they couldn't cope with the rigor of the grammar school exams, so they got diluted. So the only way they could handle it was like, let's just make the exams easier. And then you get so-called exam inflation, where you have the same grade, but it's just not as good as it was in the past.
Yeah, it's hollowed out, especially considering they changed it. So for Americans, we over here don't use the A to F you have. We have A to U. We used to. They changed it under Michael Gove to 1 to 9 as a grading system, but it's in reverse. So the 1 is the worst, the 9 is the best. And then they made it so that, for example, in an English exam, you can't take a blank book in. You just have to memorize everything. And so this is why grade inflation happens, and this is why actually boys are falling far behind girls in education, is because most boys have a specialist subject they're hyper great at. Like, I was terrible at maths, but I can speak, I suppose, with relative rhetorical flourish. If you just memorize everything on what they call little cards and things like that, if you just take
cue cards,
if you just do that, a day before the exam and have a breadth-based knowledge, you can sail through with straight A's because you're just parroting. You're not being creative or critical.
Yeah, and also the change to coursework helped girls compared to boys. But anyway, that's another story. Yeah, and then Rosen hits back with this question: well, what's your plan? So he says, have you figured out the problem of what happens when the number of places in grammar schools doesn't match the numbers of those who pass the 11 plus? No one managed to figure out in the 1950s, how does your plan work? And it's a fair point. He's saying lots of people pass the 11 plus, but there just simply weren't enough grammar schools. Now he's asking Hitchens, who doesn't tend to have a plan. He calls himself Britain's obituarist. He tends to just point out the truth and what's wrong. He doesn't necessarily have a plan. So if we go to the next one, he says, I have no plan. People like you, with their dogged opposition to the selection by ability from which you benefited, have killed any hopes of a return to it. I just seek to point out the destruction of grammar schools was a grave national error. And this is where I get really irked, because Rosen himself, who's arguing with him, went, of course, to a grammar school, then to Oxford, then to the BBC, which was the standard progression you could make then. Doesn't want anyone else to have it because he thinks, it's not fair enough. It's like, yeah, but you did really well from it, Michael. That kind of thing just makes me so mad.
It's the Orwellian middle-class socialists who would like to pull the ladder up after themselves because they like talking about poverty, but they don't actually like interacting with the poor.
Right. And it's the old Thatcher thing of like, you want everyone to be equal down here rather than a bigger gap, but we're all doing better. Anyway, so... And then actually, although Hitchens said he had no plan, in the next one, this actually was much later, but I'm just putting it next sequentially because it's the most hope I've ever seen Hitchens express. He said, politicians, someone's saying, shouldn't these issues be thrown at an education minister? No, politicians know little and care less about such things. The major political parties regard this as a dead issue. The education department is uninterested. We're discussing the past in the hope of influencing the distant future for the better. Well, I am. That's the first time I've even heard him say that I'm even trying to influence the future. Yeah. So he obviously cares about this issue a lot.
He used the word hope. That's shocking.
I know, it's shocking. I think he'll probably delete that one. Yeah. But yeah, so Hitchens said he doesn't really have a plan, but the failure was to build enough grammar schools before the bulge hit in 1956. So population increase, there wasn't enough grammar schools. Rosen's saying, look, there was too many people. They passed 11 plus. There was no place for them. He says, no, that's the politicians who didn't build enough schools. That's not the fault of selection by ability itself, which was a good system. So Rosen says everyone knew there was wastage of talent in these grammar schools. So he said the grave national error was that during the time of the grammar schools, everyone knew that the system overall was causing a huge wastage of talent, and that millions of people were not fulfilling their potential. And Hitchens sort of disputes, well, I don't know what you mean by everyone knew. But then Rosen says to him, well, you're the journalist. Go back to Halsey and Floud. Look at the materials produced by Brian Simon. Look at Hansard. Look at Ed Boyle. And it's quite interesting that he mentions Brian Simon, because Hitchens replies pointing out that Brian Simon is a literal communist. So he says,
of course,
he says, comprehensives were an egalitarian political project, not an educational one. This is why Brian Simon, a lifelong communist, was so keen on them, and why social democrats such as R.H. Tawney favoured grammars. Now, Tawney was still a socialist. He was a so-called Christian socialist.
That's impossible.
So whereas, I know so many have said, whereas Simon was an actual commie, so we're still arguing about different degrees of leftism, but he's saying that,
I hate this paradigm.
Yeah. Hitchens calls it utopians versus reformers. So if you do go to Brian Simon's Wikipedia, you do find he was in fact a leading member of the Communist Party. I mean, Wikipedia does tell you the truth about lefties, because they haven't realised that they should hide that. You know what I mean? They won't tell you the truth about the right.
He was the brother of the second Baron Simon of Wythenshawe, Roger Simon, the solicitor and writer on Antonio Gramsci, the guy who authored. He was the progenitor of cultural Marxism.
Right.
Yeah. So just staggering.
And so the fact that this is one of the key people behind comprehensive schools makes you see the kind of commie system we have now versus the grammar school system that I would wish I could have gone to and that Hitchens espouses. So he talks about it in, number 19. Well, Rosen's saying, how would this actually work? How would selection at 11 work? He's saying, if you're in favour of selection at 11, which is the only way to get grammar schools, how is that selection to be run? How are places to be allocated fairly? What difference in education in the respective schools? Hitchens replies, actually, he prefers age 13 to do the test, although anything older will be too late. I favour the German system. Briefly summed up, if you think you've been unfairly kept out of the gymnasium, you appeal and are given 2 years to show you can cope with it. So you do get a chance to move across. Your life's not just decided at 11. Seems perfectly reasonable. But he says in the next one, but it won't happen anyway. This is all futile. There's not the slightest chance of any political party adopting it. If they did, where will we find the teachers who know enough to teach the pre-1965 grammar standards? They're all thick. Also, the primary schools would need to be hugely reformed.
Basically, Hitchens has got himself. He's done all the training. He's ran up to the starting line and then pulled the gun out and shot himself in both knees.
Well, he's always just saying, I'm not saying I don't have a plan. It's just that this is the problem.
Here's the idea, but it won't get done anyway. Well,
but he always says that because he's talking about going back to 1965 standards, but at least he's pointing out we did have these standards.
Yeah.
And actually, the most new claim, perhaps, or not new, but controversial, is that the secondary moderns were much better than people thought even. Rosen points out sometimes they ask for a letter from the parents to help them decide your fate for the rest of your life. So he does admit that it's decide your fate, which is very much how I feel. I'm annoyed about my life because, imagine you went to a better school. It's a completely different world. Yeah. And I've noticed this throughout my life. So admitting that it decides your whole fate, but then Hitchens comes back with this killer blow. He said, nowadays, they don't even need to do that. On National Offer Day, your fate is decided by what sort of postcode your parents can afford to live in. No second chance. This ruthless selection by parental wealth is what you support and defend. Odd for a man of the left. So it's called the postcode lottery in this country. There's far fewer grammar schools than there were. It just depends where you live. Your parents get you in. They say, let's live here so we can get into this good school. Even those schools are not as good as they used to be, but it's a much more unfair system. And actually, Hitchens said there were always a postcode lottery. If you look at the next one, he says, this is from 1965, but particular comprehensive schools will reflect the characteristics of the neighbourhood in which they are situated. If their community is less varied and fewer of the pupils come from homes which encourage educational interests, schools may lack the stimulus and vitality which schools in other areas enjoy. Basically saying, if you're in a bad area, soz.
Yeah, we had a guy, I went to a grammar school and I have some... Well, it's run very poorly, but I like the idea of them at least. And we had a guy who pretended to live with his nan, but would commute in from Wembley every morning. And this was in Bexley, so that's from West London, South East London, every day from 11.
Wow, there you go. So and I'll skip the tweets now, but because it goes on and on. This has been going on for days. I checked on the train today; it's still going on. This argument, so it's been going on for many days. Never roused the Hitchens. And he goes into it in more detail in his article, The Golden Age of the Grammar Schools in The Spectator, which is very, very good. And he concludes it, how very strange to go through the whole education system of an advanced country, locate the one bit of it that worked and smash it up. Yet that is what we did, and that is what lies behind the mess we're in now. And I thought we'd end on a video where he sums it up. Is that his role in this is that he's the guy that knows what it used to be like. So he's just here to remind people and say, this is what it used to be like. And he calls it being Dr. What. Let's have a look.
Yes, the comprehensive system has not been a massive success, has it?
I don't think so. I think it'd be very hard to argue that if you made a straight comparison. I think what we need to do is to introduce a television series called Doctor What instead of Doctor Who. Doctor What is the only person in Britain who knows what happened in the past, and he can travel into the past and tell you what actually happened. And in this case, you can go to 1960 and say, look at the schools. Look how much better they are than the ones we have now. Comprehensive schools, to me, are much more frightening than the Daleks.
Comprehensive schools are much more frightening than the Daleks. Having been to one, can confirm.
Thanks for watching this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed that and want more, you can subscribe and become a premium member on our website, where you can access our exclusive content, including the premium live hangouts We've recently done this one, hangout number 17, Our Cyberpunk Dystopia, where Carl and Callum discuss the cyberpunk dystopia we are falling into. If you're interested in following Callum on social media, you can follow him on Getter @Callum. Thank you and goodbye.